You know, the question is on everybody's mind now. What now? Welcome back to Northern Perspective, everyone. I'm Cypher.
And I'm Fox. Today, the Conservatives moved a motion of non-confidence against the Trudeau government and tied it to the carbon tax increase coming April 1st. It didn't go the way that we had hoped, but it did go the way that we had expected.
Let's take a look.
After 8 years, it is clear that this NDP Liberal Prime Minister is not worth the cost, the crime, or the corruption. But never would we have imagined how bad would things get. Today, I look at the newspaper headlines. Even the media is noticing how bad things are. A headline in the National Post, and I quote, "Secret RCMP report warns Canadians may revolt once they realize how broke they are." The RCMP has produced a report saying that Canadians are so poor, desperate, and miserable that it may lead to political instability and other turbulence that you could not even have imagined would occur in a first world country 8 years ago. I now turn my attention to the Globe and Mail. Remember, this is the same Globe and Mail that criticized me for using the term gatekeeper to describe how homes could not get built. Well, here's their headline today. Homeownership is turning into a gated community that renters can't join. So years after saying that it was very dangerous for us to talk about gatekeepers, the Globe and Mail has now awakened to the fact that the Prime Minister in 8 years has turned homeownership into a gated community, shutting people outside of the gates. A small privileged group gets richer and richer as a growing mass of working class youth and seniors renting apartments can no longer afford any place to live. I used to warn that there were 35-year-olds living in their parents' basements. Now, that's the least of our concerns. Now we're worried that those 35-year-olds and their parents might not be able to make their mortgage payments at all. Defaults are rising rapidly. We have 35 homeless encampments in Halifax and similar encampments now in every major centre in Canada. We have 2 million people lined up at food banks in scenes that are reminiscent of the Great Depression. 35% of charities now say they're turning away people because they no longer have the resources, and food bank shelves are emptying out. Then you have people who are eating out of garbage cans. 8,000 people now having joined something called the Dumpster Divers Network, a Facebook group where they share tips on how you can climb into a garbage can and pull a meal out because there's nothing you can afford at the grocery store and nothing left at the food bank. This year, groceries are going to cost $700 more than they did last year for the average family. And in the middle of all of this, what does the NDP and this Prime Minister choose? To raise taxes. Raise taxes on food and fuel, on heat and homes. Raise taxes on all the materials that go into building a home, which will raise taxes on all who buy the home. Raise taxes on heating that home. Raise taxes on the gas and diesel needed to get to work to earn a paycheck to make payments on that home. And raise taxes on the farmers who make the food, the truckers who ship the food, the grocers who sell the food, and therefore all who buy the food, as if the desperation were not bad enough. And this in light of all the evidence that has come out that now 60% of Canadians are paying more in carbon tax than they get back in rebates. A fact that I have read into this record time and time again, a fact that the Prime Minister continues to attempt to hide from, a fact that the Parliamentary Budget Officer just testified to, and a fact that we did not need all of those accurate calculations to know, because every single person who's opening their empty fridge to wonder how they're going to feed their kids already knew that fact was real. Madam Speaker, we cannot in good conscience stand by while this Prime Minister imposes more misery and suffering on the Canadian people. Canadians are good, they are decent, they are hardworking. They do not have to give up on the things they used to take for granted, affordable food and homes, just for the incompetence of ego of one man. He is not worth the cost. He is not worth the crime. He is not worth the corruption. He is not worth giving up the country that we knew and still love. We as common sense Conservatives are ready to restore hope in this country, but it starts with change. We rise today to vote non-confidence in this NDP Liberal government and to restore the great country that we love based on the common sense of the common people united for our common home. Your home, my home, our home. Let's bring it home.
So that speech happened around, I'd say, 10:30 this morning. And we were watching that, and we watched a lot of people talk. The entire House of Commons was occupied today with debating the carbon tax motion. You heard from the Liberals, you heard from the Bloc, you heard from the NDP, and while there was some, moments of hope when you were listening to the NDP and you think, well, maybe they may vote against the Liberals. As the day went on and some of the other members like Charlie Angus got up and Peter Julian and those types of people, it became clear where they were going to vote. And I think the Conservatives, they kind of expected this. They probably held an outside chance of hope. What do you think, Fox?
I honestly think that considering all three major party leaders were not present in the House for this non-confidence vote, I think they all at least suspected how it was going to go. I think perhaps the Conservatives just tossed in like a wild card to hope that maybe it would go the way that they wanted. But considering the three leaders weren't there, I think everybody knew in their hearts the way it was going to go.
Yeah, so unfortunately it was mainly the Conservatives that stood up. But the interesting thing is there was one NDP MP that actually voted yes. Doesn't really matter who it was, but because I don't want to give them any publicity. But the fact that one NDP member voted yes, that makes me raise an eyebrow.
There was also one Liberal MP that voted yes, as in, I have no confidence left in the Prime Minister. However, that was, in the end, it turned out to be an error.
Yeah, so, and that Liberal MP was Pam Damoff, and she voted remotely, so she probably just hit the wrong button at that point. So the Conservatives all voted yes, the Bloc voted no, and the NDP voted no, and as you can expect, the motion was subsequently defeated. So, the question is on everybody's mind now. What now? If the Conservatives had an inkling that this is the way it would go, why call it in the first place? Well, we have some thoughts on that. Now, one thing that Fox and I were talking about is that, well, why would Pierre go out of his way to move a motion? Because later, like tonight, they're actually voting on businesses of supply. And, it has to do with money. And each of those is a confidence vote in itself by default. So the question is why would he go out of his way to move a motion of non-confidence when these votes were already confidence votes? Well,
and especially if, as we suspect, all of the leaders kind of knew how this would go anyways. Interestingly, Pierre Poilievre had a fundraiser in Toronto tonight. So why would he move a motion like this when he knows he's occupied at a fundraiser?
So as we were thinking about this, I about halfway through the day, I had this thought, and I think this is why. So there's still some good that came out of today, because here's the thing about this. You have to think about the timing, and you have to think about who was really targeted here. It may look like the Liberals were targeted, but I don't think it was them that was in Pierre's crosshairs. I think it was the NDP. specifically Jagmeet Singh. So what do we mean by that? Well, it's March 21st, and it's almost a month to the day that the federal riding boundary changes come into effect. Now, why would Pierre call this now versus right before that? Well, the thing about the other confidence, votes, as it relates to just approving liberal bills and liberal motions and that sort of thing, is that if polls go up or down, there's no way to really measure that, right? But if you go out of your way to put forth a vote of non-confidence, and then obviously there's subsequent polls after that, then you can, with a certain degree of reliability, attribute the changes in the polls to that vote of non-confidence that didn't go through. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, we have been seeing in at least the Abacus polling that the NDP support has been dropping and dropping and dropping to pre-2021 election levels. Now, I think what Pierre wants to have happen here, and what the NDP are going to be paying close attention to, is how do they poll following this non-confidence vote?
Well, because Nanos did a survey back at the beginning of the year, back in January, and they found that 46% of respondents indicated that they wanted an election either like right now, so at the time of the survey in January, or sometime in 2024. That's almost half of Canadians. So almost half of Canadians, and it's probably more now because it's March, but almost half of Canadians want an election. And they're seeing on CPAC that the NDP are denying them this election. And you know what? Not only the NDP, it was the Bloc this time too. So guess who they're going to be angry at?
So as the next polls come out, the weekly check-in polls with Abacus and Nanos and Main Street and Leger and all of them, I think what you're going to see is a lot of really aggravated Canadians, and you're going to see that support for the NDP decline even more. So what does that do? Well, it essentially boxes Jagmeet into a corner, and it forces him to make a decision. And that decision is going to be, all right, you only have really one shot left at deciding what are you going to do prior to the boundary change. And the polls are going to push him one way or the other. Now, the issue with him is that he has to go now if he's going to go. Because if he waits until May, which is when the budget vote is probably going to happen, the budget is presented April 16th, but the vote is probably going to happen in May, then it's actually a silly move, because what you've done is you've given yourself, another couple of weeks, and your polling has probably dipped another point, and now you've made it harder for yourself because of the election, the riding boundary change. So it doesn't make any sense to do it in May. And the longer this goes, the longer Canadians are going to have to deal with the new carbon tax. They're going to have to deal with the additional mortgage defaults. And they're going to have to deal with additional, trouble buying food. So the polls will only get worse for the Conservatives and the Liberals.
The longer this goes on, the worse things will be for the Liberal and NDP parties, because their leaders are driving these parties into the ground with these ridiculous policies that are hurting Canadians.
So as Jagmeet continues to watch these polls, and if he sees them continue to decline, and more importantly, if the rest of the NDP MPs see this continue to decline, it may actually force them to do something, which is vote with the Conservatives in a non-confidence vote, and it may even cause them to call them themselves. But I think the best case for the Conservatives and the worst case for the NDP is if they end up deciding, by the time the budget vote comes, okay, well, we can't wait any longer, we have to go. Well, the Conservatives now celebrate 4 more seats, and the NDP, they end up, making a election the most difficult for them as it possibly can be, because They've lost some seats due to the rounding boundary changes, and they're just going to have that much more trouble because of the way the new lines are drawn. So Jagmeet has virtually one more shot at salvaging this. The question is he going to do it?